2,000 years after Rome learned to fight, a different kind of warrior emerged from the cold edge of the world. And for 300 years, they made every coastline in Europe a place of fear. This is the story of the Vikings. And it starts with a single morning that changed everything. 793 AD, the island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of northern England. A monastery. Monks going about their morning routine. Prayer, scripture, the slow rhythm of religious life that hadn't changed in centuries. Then the sea, which had been empty their entire lives, was suddenly full of ships. Long, narrow, fast, moving against the wind in ways that made no sense to anyone watching from shore. Men poured out of them. Within hours, the monastery was burning, its treasures stolen, its monks dead or enslaved. A scholar at Charlemagne's own court would later write that never before had such terror appeared in Britain. He wasn't exaggerating. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. That single raid announced the beginning of the Viking Age. But to understand why it happened, and why it happened then, you have to understand the place these men came from. Scandinavia is not a forgiving land. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, thin soil, brutal winters, a growing season measured in weeks. The sea is not a feature of life here. It is the only reason life is possible at all. People who live like this learn one lesson early: adapt or die. By the late 700s, that lesson had become a crisis. Scandinavia's population had grown for generations, but the farmable land had not grown with it. Inheritance laws meant that younger sons, second sons, third sons, often got nothing. No land, no status, no future at home. Meanwhile, the established trade routes along the coast were controlled by older families who had no interest in sharing. For a generation of young men with nothing to inherit and the sea in their blood, there was exactly one path open to them. Go raiding, go trading. Go take what you needed, wherever the water could carry you. The Old Norse word for this activity was vik, a bay, an inlet, the kind of hidden cove a raiding party launched from. To go Viking wasn't to belong to a nation or a tribe. It was to do a job. And the job paid extraordinarily well, because almost nobody in Europe was prepared to defend against it. Here is the weapon that made it all possible. Not the axe, not the sword, the ship. European shipbuilders at this time built heavy, deep-hulled vessels meant for calm, predictable waters. The Viking longship was something else entirely. Built using overlapping oak planks, clinker construction, riveted together and sealed with tar and wool, the hull was flexible. It moved with the waves instead of fighting them, which meant it could survive open ocean in conditions that would have torn apart anything the rest of Europe was building. But the detail that mattered most was the draft, how deep the ship sat in the water. Less than 1 meter, fully loaded with 60 armed men. A ship that could cross the North Atlantic could also sail up a river that wasn't deep enough to float a rowboat. This single fact rewrote the rules of European warfare. No monastery, no village, no trading town was safe just because it sat inland. If there was a river, a longship could reach it. And on a strong wind, that ship could cover 200 miles in a single day, faster than any warning could travel by horse or messenger. The monks of Lindisfarne had perhaps 2 hours between the first sighting and the first sword. By the time anyone inland could have been warned, it was already finished. For the next 60 years, this pattern repeated itself across an entire continent. Norwegian raiders pushed west, into Scotland, into Ireland, into the Orkney and Faroe Islands, eventually as far as Iceland. They didn't only raid these places, they settled them, planting Norse farming communities along coastlines that had never seen a foreign flag. Danish raiders pushed south, down the French coast, around the Iberian Peninsula, into the Mediterranean itself. In 844 AD, a Norse fleet sacked Seville, and 15 years later, another reached the coast of North Africa. Swedish raiders pushed east, across the Baltic Sea, and into the river systems of what is now Russia, heading toward Constantinople and Baghdad. 3 directions, 3 separate waves of expansion, 1 piece of technology behind all of it. The strategy worked because it was never about holding ground. Hit a target, take everything valuable, load the ship, and be back at sea before anyone organized a response. Monasteries were the perfect target. Centuries of donated gold and silver sitting behind walls staffed by men who had never held a weapon in their lives. But by the middle of the 9th century, the easy targets were running dry. The monasteries had been stripped, and the Vikings adapted again, this time into something far more dangerous than raiders. They stopped going home. Danish forces operating in England and France began wintering in fortified camps instead of sailing back to Scandinavia in the autumn. This was a different kind of war. Raiding required speed. Conquest required the ability to hold ground through an entire season, defend it, and use it as a base for the next campaign. In 865 AD, a force chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party. Within 5 years, it had destroyed 3 of England's 4 kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, all fallen. Only Wessex remained, and Wessex was ruled by a young king named Alfred, who, in early 878, found himself driven into hiding in the Somerset marshes with a handful of followers. A king with no kingdom, no army, and no obvious path back. He didn't stay there. Alfred rebuilt. He reorganized his military, constructed a network of fortified towns, the origin of the modern word borough, and built England's first real navy. When the Danes pushed again, they found a different opponent. At the Battle of Edington in 878 AD, Alfred broke the Danish advance decisively. The peace that followed split England in 2, a line running roughly through the middle of the country, Danish law and Danish settlers to the north and east, Saxon rule to the south and west. 2 countries sharing 1 island. Over in France, a Viking chieftain named Rollo chose a completely different path to power. Instead of fighting the Frankish kingdom, he made a deal with it. In 911 AD, the Frankish king offered Rollo land at the mouth of the Seine River. In exchange for Rollo's loyalty, his conversion to Christianity, and his protection of the coast from other Viking raiders. Rollo accepted. The territory was called the Land of the Northmen. Normandy. Within 4 generations, Rollo's descendants had stopped speaking Norse entirely. They spoke French. They married into French nobility. They built French castles and worshipped in French cathedrals. They were, in every visible way, no longer Vikings at all. And then, in 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, a man called William the Bastard, sailed a fleet across the English Channel and conquered England by force. The Normans who took England that year were Vikings. They had simply stopped looking like it. Far to the east, a different group of Norse traders was building something just as remarkable, but with almost no violence at all. Swedish traders called Varangians pushed down the river systems of modern Russia and Ukraine, carrying furs, amber, and slaves south in exchange for Byzantine gold and Arab silver. Archaeologists have found hundreds of thousands of Arab silver coins buried in Swedish soil. Physical proof of a trade network stretching from the Baltic Sea to Baghdad. Along these river routes, Varangian traders built fortified trading posts that grew into cities. Novgorod, Kiev, the foundation of what would become the first Russian state. The Byzantine emperor noticed how formidable these Norse warriors were and recruited them as his personal bodyguard, the Varangian Guard, the most feared soldiers in the Byzantine military for the next 2 centuries. One of those guardsmen, a Norwegian named Harald Hardrada, would eventually go home, become King of Norway, and lead the very last great Viking invasion in history. By the 11th century, England had been fought over, conquered, and ruled by Norse kings for 200 years. The Danish king Knut had once ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously, governing so effectively that English nobles who had fought against him became his most loyal supporters. But Knut's line died out, and the Old English dynasty returned to the throne. When King Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066, 3 different men believed the English crown belonged to them. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, crowned by the council on the very day Edward died. Harald Hardrada of Norway, a legendary warrior with a claim built on old dynastic promises, fresh from years inside the Byzantine emperor's personal guard. William of Normandy, 5 generations removed from Rollo the Viking, claiming Edward had promised him the throne years before. In September of 1066, all 3 collided within the span of 3 weeks. Harald Hardrada struck first, landing in the north of England with a fleet of nearly 300 ships. The local English earls marched to stop him and were crushed at the Battle of Fulford Gate. 5 days later, Harold Godwinson arrived, having force-marched his army nearly 200 miles in 4 days, an almost impossible feat of logistics for the period. His men were exhausted. He attacked anyway, immediately, without rest. At Stamford Bridge, on September 25, 1066, the last great Viking invasion of England ended in a single brutal afternoon. Harald Hardrada was killed by an arrow through the throat. Of the nearly 300 ships that had carried his army across the North Sea, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The Viking Age, as a military force capable of conquering kingdoms, was over. 3 days later, William of Normandy's fleet landed on England's southern coast. Harold Godwinson, his army still exhausted from Stamford Bridge, marched south to meet him. At Hastings, the Norman cavalry broke the English shield wall, and William took the throne of England. The conquerors that day were, by blood, Vikings. They had just stopped knowing it. The Viking Age didn't end with a single defeat. It ended because the world that had made it possible had quietly disappeared. Christianity spread through Scandinavia over the course of a century. Denmark in the late 900s, Norway around the year 1000, Sweden not long after. This was not only a religious shift. The old Norse warrior culture had glorified a violent death in battle as the highest possible achievement, a guaranteed path to Valhalla. Christian theology had no room for that idea at all. Killing was a sin requiring penance, not a ticket to paradise. The entire psychological engine behind Viking raiding lost its fuel. At the same time, European kingdoms stopped being easy targets. Coastal fortifications went up. Early warning systems were built. Kings consolidated power and had every incentive to stop their own subjects from raiding the trading partners they now relied on. The asymmetric advantage the longship had provided for 3 centuries quietly eroded year by year until raiding simply wasn't worth the risk anymore. The Vikings didn't vanish. They became something else. Traders instead of raiders. Christian kings instead of pagan chieftains. Norman dukes instead of Norse jarls. But what they left behind is still everywhere, if you know where to look. The days of the week in English are named for Norse gods. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Words like sky, knife, window, husband, anger, all Old Norse, sitting inside modern English so completely that nobody notices anymore. Place names across northern England ending in by and Thorpe are linguistic fossils of Danish settlements that have survived 1,000 years. In Russia, the trading posts Varangian merchants built along the rivers became Kiev, the founding city of an entire civilization. In France, the Norse settlers who became Normans went on to conquer southern Italy, Sicily, and helped lead the First Crusade. And 500 years before Columbus ever set sail, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson landed on the coast of North America and called it Vinland. The voyage happened. The settlement didn't survive, but the Vikings reached the Americas first, and almost nobody remembers it. Not bad in the end, for men who started out stealing church silver from undefended island monasteries. If this story captured you, the next one is already waiting. Subscribe and hit the bell. We cover one military history story every week, and none of them are short.